The rancher rescued the Apache woman from deadly cold, and the chief's question changed everything. The cold winter wind had begun to bite at the edges of the small ranch where John Miller lived. The land stretched wide and empty, with rolling hills and distant mountains, and the snow had already started to cover the ground in a thin, icy blanket. John had lived here for decades, alone for most of the time since his wife had passed. He knew the ranch like the back of his hand, the moods of the animals, the feel of the wind, and the way the snow settled in the hollows of the land. Yet even with all his experience, this winter felt sharper than usual, harsher in ways that made him tighten his coat every time he stepped outside. That evening, John was feeding his cattle, their low murmurs and the crunch of their hooves in the snow the only sounds around him. The sky was a pale gray, and the last light of the day was fading quickly. As he scattered hay near the barn, he noticed something unusual. Tracks in the snow. At first he thought they were made by a fox or a coyote, but as he looked closer, he realized the tracks were too small, too delicate, and hurried to be from any ordinary animal. They were human. John frowned. Few people passed near his ranch during winter, and the snow made any travel difficult and dangerous. Curious, but cautious, he decided to follow the footprints. They led away from the barn and toward the rocky canyon that bordered the ranch. The wind whipped around him, carrying snowflakes that stung his face, and he wrapped his scarf tighter around his neck. He moved slowly, every step careful, scanning the terrain. The tracks led him to a small cluster of rocks, and there he saw her. She was crouched low, shivering violently, her body trembling under the thin layers of clothing she wore. Her skin was pale from the cold, and her hair, dark and tangled, fell over her face. She was very young, maybe in her early 20s, and something about her reminded John of the harshness of the winter he had spent his life trying to endure. She looked up at him, wide-eyed, and for a moment, fear and hope battled in her expression. John didn't hesitate. He carefully approached her, speaking in calm, low tones. "It's okay, you're safe now." The woman flinched, her body tensing, but she didn't move away. She was too weak. He could see that her lips were blue from the cold and that her hands were stiff, almost numb. Without another word, he crouched beside her, gently lifting her in his strong arms. She made a small sound, like a shiver mixed with a gasp, but she didn't resist. Back at the cabin, John quickly made a fire. The flames danced and crackled, sending warmth through the small room. He wrapped the woman in thick blankets and set a cup of hot broth near her lips. At first, she only sipped a little, her hands trembling as she held the cup. She was quiet, and John respected her silence. He knew she must have faced dangers that made trust difficult, and he did not want to scare her. As the fire warmed her slowly, John studied her more closely. Her clothing was torn in places, and snowflakes still clung to her hair and coat. Her eyes were dark and alert, watching him carefully. He wondered how she had survived in the freezing cold and harsh wilderness alone. There were no trails leading back to any nearby towns, and the snowstorm had likely hidden any other signs of life. Whoever she was, she had been in real danger. Gradually she spoke, her voice soft and hesitant. "Thank you," she said, the words almost a whisper. John smiled gently. "Don't worry, you're safe here. You can rest." He gave her a warm blanket and a dry set of clothes he had kept for emergencies. She accepted them slowly, as if still unsure whether she could trust anyone. Over the next few hours, John fed her, checked her carefully for frostbite or injuries, and kept the fire strong. He offered her water, bread, and more broth, and she began to eat a little more confidently. She still shivered, but the warmth of the cabin and the fire began to soothe her aching body. He noticed that she looked worn out, exhausted not only from the cold, but from whatever had brought her to this lonely canyon in the first place. By the time night fully settled, the wind outside had grown louder, rattling the windows and whistling through the cracks of the cabin. John sat across from her, watching her as she rested, and he felt a mixture of concern and curiosity. He wanted to know who she was and where she had come from, but he also knew he needed to earn her trust first. He decided to wait until she felt stronger. Finally, after a long silence, she managed a few words. "Aeon, my name Aeon." John nodded. "It's good to meet you, Aeon." "I'm John." He spoke slowly, carefully, so she could understand. She nodded slightly, her eyes wary but beginning to relax. Her voice was quiet, almost fragile, but there was strength in her gaze. John realized that Aeon was probably from a nearby Apache community. Her features, the way she carried herself even in exhaustion, and her careful, cautious movements all suggested that she had grown up in a world deeply connected to the land and the wilderness. He remembered stories of the Apache people from his childhood, tales of survival, courage, and respect for the earth. But this woman, weak and near death from the cold, was far from the strong image he had imagined. He decided to give her time. He kept the fire going through the night, bringing more blankets and checking the doors and windows against the wind. Aeon rested quietly, occasionally murmuring words in her own language. John didn't understand them, but he listened carefully, respecting her words and her presence. By morning, she was slightly stronger, able to sit up and sip more broth without spilling it. Her shivering had slowed, and her color had returned to her cheeks. Over the next few days, John and Aeon slowly formed a routine. She helped him with small chores around the cabin, fetching water, arranging firewood, and tending to the animals. Her movements were careful and precise, showing skills that came from growing up close to nature. John admired her resilience, noticing that despite everything she had endured, she had a quiet strength that was rare and inspiring. They began to communicate more effectively. John learned a few words in her language, and she learned simple English phrases. They shared small stories of their lives. John about his years on the ranch, the loneliness after his wife's passing, and the challenges of surviving in the harsh winters. Aeon shared fragments of her life too, telling him about her family, her community, and the traditions she held dear. Even though their words were limited, the meaning was clear. They were learning to trust one another. One evening, as the firelight flickered across the cabin walls, John realized how unusual this connection was. He had lived alone for so long, thinking he preferred solitude, but now he felt the warmth of companionship that had nothing to do with romance or friendship in the ordinary sense. It was a bond forged through necessity, survival, and quiet understanding. Aeon had trusted him enough to accept his help, and he had trusted her enough to protect her when she was at her most vulnerable. Outside, the wind continued to howl, but inside the cabin, there was a fragile peace. John knew the cold winter nights were not over, and that the journey ahead for Aeon would be difficult once she left his cabin. Yet he felt determined to see her safe. He had rescued her from near death, and now he would guide her back to safety, even if the path was dangerous and uncertain. For now, though, they rested, sharing the quiet warmth of the fire. Aeon, once a figure of fear and despair in the freezing canyon, now had a safe place to recover. John, once a solitary rancher, had found a sense of purpose and connection he had not felt in years. Both understood without speaking aloud that this meeting was no accident. Fate had brought them together in the cold wilderness, and together they would face the challenges that lay ahead. The night deepened, but the cabin glowed with warmth, hope, and the quiet understanding that sometimes even the harshest winters could bring people together in ways neither could have expected. The morning after the harsh winter night, Aeon awoke slowly. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the first light of day crept through the small cabin window, casting soft orange streaks across the wooden floor. She felt warmer than the day before, though her muscles ached from the cold she had endured outside. For the first time in days, she felt the strength to move freely, and that small comfort brought a faint smile to her lips. John was already up, tending to the animals. The cattle waited patiently in the pen, their breaths forming tiny clouds in the cold morning air. He had laid out a small breakfast of bread, hot tea, and cooked eggs. Seeing Aeon stir, he called softly, "Morning, Aeon. Breakfast is ready. Eat as much as you can." She nodded, grateful for the kindness, and wrapped her hands around the warm cup of tea. The heat seeped into her cold fingers and slowly spread through her body. Aeon was quiet at first, unsure how much to say. She had learned to be careful around strangers. Humans could be unpredictable, and trust was earned, not given freely. Yet something about John felt different. His movements were calm and deliberate, his tone gentle, and there was no hint of judgment in his gaze. Slowly, she allowed herself to eat and speak, answering him in broken English when necessary. "I walk lost," she said finally, her voice soft. "Snow deep no find way." John nodded, understanding from her simple words. "It's all right now. You're safe here," he replied. He gestured to the cabin, the blankets, and the small fire still glowing in the corner. Aeon looked around, taking in the warmth, the safety, and the quiet strength of the man who had rescued her. Over the next few days, John and Aeon developed a routine. She helped with small chores around the cabin, fetching water from the well and gathering firewood. He taught her how to use the tools safely and how to care for the animals. Though her movements were careful, they were also precise and skilled. She clearly knew how to live in the wilderness, even if the cold had caught her unprepared. Watching her work, John realized that Aeon had a deep understanding of nature, something he respected deeply. Communication between them improved slowly. John learned a few words in her language, enough to ask simple questions about her well-being and her past. Aeon learned more English, enough to respond in short sentences. They shared stories, though simple, that revealed much about their lives. John spoke of his years on the ranch, the loneliness after losing his wife, and the harsh winters that had tested him countless times. Aeon spoke of her family, the traditions of her people, and the lessons she had learned about survival and respect for the land. One evening, after the fire had burned down to a soft glow, Aeon looked at John and asked quietly, Why help me?" Her words were hesitant, yet there was genuine curiosity behind them. John paused, thinking carefully. "Because any life matters," he said slowly. "You were in danger, I could help, I had to." He looked at her, his eyes steady and honest. She nodded, seeming to understand. It was not just words, they were a connection, a recognition of shared humanity. The trust between them grew in small ways. Aeon began to share more details of her journey before John had found her. She had been separated from her family during a hunting trip, lost in the mountains as the snowstorm came quickly and unexpectedly. She had wandered for days, searching for a path back, facing freezing nights and treacherous terrain. Her voice quivered as she spoke of the nights she had lain in the snow, feeling her strength fade. John listened quietly, offering comfort with small gestures, a hand on her shoulder, a warm blanket, a reassuring smile. John also shared moments from his past. He told her about his late wife, about the years he had spent raising the ranch alone, and about the deep connection he felt to the land. Aeon listened with wide, attentive eyes, intrigued by a life so different from her own. She asked questions, sometimes in her limited English, sometimes in her own language, and John tried his best to answer. Their conversations were simple, but they carried a depth of understanding that went beyond words. One day, John decided to take Aeon outside, even though the snow was still heavy in places. He wanted her to see the full ranch, the animals, and the land that had shaped his life. She followed him carefully, her eyes wide with curiosity. The cattle watched her cautiously, sensing her gentleness. She reached out to touch the animals, and they responded with calm acceptance. John watched her, impressed by her patience and respect for the creatures. As they walked, Aeon began to show John how she read the land. She pointed to small tracks in the snow, signs of hidden water, and subtle changes in the trees that hinted at the weather ahead. John listened, fascinated by her knowledge. It was a skill he had never fully mastered, and he realized how much he could learn from her. The exchange of skills and knowledge became a bridge between their worlds, one shaped by a lifetime on a ranch, the other by a life immersed in the rhythms of nature. Over time, Aeon's strength returned. Her shivering lessened, her skin regained color, and her movements became more confident. She no longer hesitated to carry water or feed the animals. John watched with quiet pride, understanding that she was ready for the next step, the journey back to her people. But he also knew that leaving his cabin and venturing back into the winter wilderness would not be easy. The mountains were dangerous, and the cold still held many threats. One night, as the wind howled outside and snowflakes danced against the windows, Aeon sat by the fire, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea. John joined her, and they sat in silence for a while, listening to the storm. Finally, Aeon spoke, her voice soft but steady. "I thank you," she said. "You help me more than words." John nodded, touched by her sincerity. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "We all need help sometimes, that's what matters." Their bond, though still new, had grown strong. It was built on trust, respect, and the understanding that they had both faced challenges and hardships in life. Aeon had survived near death, and John had chosen to act without hesitation. Together, they had created a small world of safety and care amidst the harsh winter. John knew that soon he would have to guide Aeon back to her people. The journey would be long and dangerous, but he was determined to see her safely returned. He had come to care deeply for her well-being, and he understood that her life depended on the careful planning of their steps ahead. Yet, even as he thought about the journey, he felt a quiet joy in the connection they had formed. Aeon, too, had begun to feel something she had not experienced in a long time, a sense of hope and security. The fear and exhaustion that had accompanied her journey were slowly replaced by trust. She had learned that kindness could exist even in the harshest of winters, and that survival sometimes depended on the willingness to accept help. Her respect for John grew, and she began to see him not just as a rescuer, but as a teacher, a guide, and a friend. The days passed, each one reinforcing their bond. They shared meals, stories, and moments of quiet reflection by the fire. Aeon helped John tend the animals, and he showed her how to maintain the cabin and manage the ranch. Their collaboration was seamless, each learning from the other in ways that strengthened their connection. By the time the snow had begun to settle fully on the ground, they were no longer two strangers brought together by chance, but companions bound by trust, understanding, and the shared experience of survival. As the first signs of preparation for their journey began, John looked at Aeon with a mixture of pride and concern. He knew that leading her back to her people would require careful planning, patience, and courage. Yet he also understood that she was ready, stronger than she had been when he first found her, wiser in ways that only struggle and hardship could teach. They would face the wilderness together, and he felt confident that, whatever dangers lay ahead, they would face them side by side. That night, as the cabin settled into quiet, John and Aeon sat together by the fire, the glow illuminating their faces. Neither spoke much, but the silence was comfortable, filled with understanding. Outside, the winter storm raged on, but inside, there was warmth, safety, and trust. The fragile connection they had begun to form was now strong enough to guide them through whatever lay ahead. The harsh winter had brought them together in a way neither could have anticipated. In the face of danger and uncertainty, they had found trust, hope, and a new understanding of each other. And as they prepared for the journey back to Aeon's people, both knew that this bond, formed in the cold and strengthened by compassion, would carry them through the challenges to come. The morning sky was pale and cold as John prepared for the journey ahead. Snow lay thick across the ranch, covering the ground in a soft but treacherous blanket. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying a chill that promised more storms to come. John packed supplies carefully, blankets, dried food, water, and a small first aid kit. Every item had to be useful because the journey would be long and dangerous. Aeon watched quietly, her eyes alert and thoughtful. She had grown stronger since the day John had found her in the canyon, but she still understood the dangers the cold could bring. She helped him load the supplies onto his horse, choosing the pieces she could carry herself. Ready," she said simply, her voice steady. John nodded. "Good, we travel together, step by step." They mounted their horses and started down the trail leading into the mountains. The snow crunched beneath the hooves, and the cold air stung their faces. Aeon glanced around, noticing subtle changes in the landscape, shadows that hinted at hidden rocks, patterns in the snow that spoke of animals moving nearby. She pointed to a trail and John nodded, impressed by her sharp observation. Even in her weakened state, her instincts were strong, and he began to rely on her guidance as much as she relied on his strength. The first day of travel was slow but steady. They crossed frozen streams and climbed gentle slopes, taking care with each step. Aeon occasionally stumbled, but John was quick to steady her. "Careful," he said. "One misstep could hurt us both." She nodded, gripping the reins tightly, her dark eyes fixed on the trail ahead. Despite the cold and exhaustion, there was a quiet determination in her that reminded John why he had risked everything to save her. As they moved deeper into the mountains, the weather began to change. The wind picked up, carrying flurries of snow that stung their faces. Visibility dropped, and the trail became harder to follow. John knew they had to find a sheltered spot for the night before the storm grew stronger. They came across a small rock overhang that offered some protection. John built a fire carefully, shielding it from the wind, while Aeon helped gather small pieces of wood scattered nearby. The warmth of the flames brought relief, and for a moment they sat quietly, savoring the small comfort of safety. Aeon had grown more confident during their travels. She shared her knowledge of survival in the wild. "Snow trap water," she said, breaking ice in a small bowl to melt it. "Food look for tracks, follow rabbits, fish in stream." John listened, learning from her. Her skills complemented his own, and together, they managed to create a small system for survival. The danger of the mountains seemed slightly less frightening because they faced it together. The journey was not without danger. On the second day, as they crossed a narrow ridge, a sudden gust of wind nearly toppled Aeon's horse. John grabbed her reins, steadying the animal just in time. She exhaled sharply, but there was no fear in her eyes, only determination. "Thank you," she said softly. "Always careful." John nodded, realizing that her trust in him had grown stronger. They had become more than companions, they were partners in survival. As they pressed on, the snow deepened, making travel slower. The horses struggled through drifts that sometimes reached to their knees. Aeon's hands were red and stiff, but she did not complain. John wrapped her fingers in extra cloth, and she smiled briefly, a small gesture of gratitude. They had learned to communicate without words, understanding each other through gestures, glances, and shared experience. One afternoon, as they rested near a frozen stream, Aeon noticed faint tracks in the snow. She pointed to them, and John studied the trail carefully. Wolves, he realized, small, cautious wolves traveling in a pack. The animals were not aggressive, but they were curious. John motioned for Aeon to stay close, keeping the horses between them and the tracks. The wolves watched from a distance, their yellow eyes glowing in the fading light before disappearing into the trees. Aeon looked at John with wide eyes, a mixture of awe and respect. "Nature watch," she said. John smiled. "Yes, it's always watching. We must be careful." The days passed, each one testing their endurance and courage. They faced frozen rivers, sharp rocks hidden beneath the snow, and treacherous slopes that threatened to send the horses sliding. Yet with each challenge, their confidence in each other grew. Aeon's instincts guided them through hidden dangers, while John's strength and experience kept them on track. The bond between them became stronger with every step, built on trust, shared responsibility, and the quiet understanding that they depended on each other for survival. One evening, as the sky darkened and a fresh snowstorm began, John and Aeon found themselves facing a steep slope. The wind howled fiercely, and visibility dropped to almost nothing. John held onto the reins tightly, guiding his horse cautiously. Aeon stayed close, her hands gripping her horse's mane. "Slow, slow," John instructed. Step by step they moved, their horses slipping occasionally but recovering each time. When they finally reached the top of the slope, both were exhausted but relieved. They found shelter beneath a rocky outcrop, where they built a fire and huddled close for warmth. That night, as the wind rattled the rocks above them, John and Aeon shared a rare moment of conversation. Aeon spoke of her family, describing her people's traditions, the stories passed down through generations, and the lessons she had learned about living in harmony with the land. John listened intently, fascinated by her knowledge and the depth of her respect for nature. He realized that this journey was not only about survival, but also about learning from each other, understanding a world he had never fully known. Aeon, in turn, listened as John spoke of his life on the ranch. He told her about the challenges of raising cattle alone, the long winters, and the lessons learned from years of solitude. She asked questions, her eyes wide with curiosity, and he answered as best he could. Their conversations were simple but meaningful, bridging the gap between two very different lives. The storm continued into the night, but they remained safe under the rocks. The fire crackled and the warmth brought comfort, though the cold outside reminded them of the danger still lurking beyond their shelter. Aeon leaned slightly against John, not out of need but out of trust. He glanced at her, recognizing the bond they had formed. It was not just survival that had brought them together. It was respect, understanding, and a shared determination to face the challenges ahead. In the following days, the weather gradually improved. The snow began to settle, the wind softened, and the trail became easier to follow. Yet the journey was far from over. They still had mountains to cross and valleys to navigate before reaching Aeon's people. Each day was a careful balance of caution and determination, requiring them to rely on each other's strengths and knowledge. Aeon continued to impress John with her resourcefulness. She found small streams for water, noticed hidden hazards in the snow, and even helped guide the horses over tricky terrain. John, in turn, shared his experience with navigation, tracking, and managing the animals. Together, they moved steadily forward, each learning from the other, each trusting the other to make the right decisions. By the end of the week, they had crossed half the distance to the Apache village. Fatigue was beginning to show, but neither wavered. They shared food and warmth, encouraged each other during moments of doubt, and celebrated small successes along the way. Their connection had grown beyond mere survival. It was a deep friendship forged in adversity, strengthened by mutual respect and understanding. One day, as they approached a narrow canyon path, a large tree suddenly fell from the slope above, crashing near their horses. Aeon reacted quickly, pulling her horse to the side just in time. John grabbed her reins and steadied her, both of them breathing heavily from the sudden danger. Aeon's eyes met John's, filled with gratitude and trust. "You saved me again," she said softly. John shook his head, smiling faintly. "We save each other, that's what matters." That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the snow in soft shades of pink and orange, they paused to rest. The journey had been long and perilous, yet they had grown stronger, wiser, and closer through the shared struggle. The bond of trust between them was unbreakable now, formed through challenges, survival, and the quiet understanding that they depended on one another. As night fell, they prepared to camp once more, huddled together by the fire. Aeon rested her head briefly on her folded arms, exhausted but at peace. John watched the fire, thinking about the journey still ahead and the people waiting for her at the end. He knew the final part of their journey would test them further, but he also knew they were ready. Together they had faced the wilderness and survived. Together they would reach her people safely. The mountains loomed around them, silent and majestic, yet full of hidden dangers. The snow, though now settled, could conceal threats. The wind could rise again without warning. But inside their small circle of firelight, John and Aeon found warmth, strength, and an unspoken promise to protect each other until the journey was complete. The sun was beginning to rise over the distant mountains when John and Aeon finally reached the edge of the forest that marked the territory of her people. The snow had softened, revealing the trails and paths hidden during their long journey through the harsh winter. Aeon's eyes widened with recognition as she saw familiar signs, the way the trees leaned in the wind, the patterns of animal tracks, and the small river that ran nearby. Her heart beat faster, both from relief and anticipation. She had survived the cold, the isolation, and the dangerous journey, but now she would finally return to her people. John rode beside her, careful to keep the horses steady as they descended into the valley. He had grown deeply attached to Aeon over the course of their journey, and the thought of leaving her among strangers made him uneasy. Yet he also knew that her people would provide her the safety, warmth, and family connection she had been missing. He trusted that she would be welcomed, but he could not shake a small sense of worry. As they entered the village, the Apache people emerged cautiously. Some stood at the edges, observing the strangers, while others began to approach, curious and wary. Aeon's eyes lit up with recognition, and she dismounted quickly, her legs stiff from the long journey. She ran a few steps toward a group of women who were tending small children, and they welcomed her with hugs and exclamations of joy. John watched from a distance, feeling a mixture of relief and pride. He had kept her safe, and now she was finally among her own. The chief of the village, an older man with deep lines on his face and eyes that seemed to see everything, approached slowly. His presence commanded respect, and John instinctively straightened in his saddle. The chief's gaze was steady, and he studied John carefully. It was clear that this man was testing him, not with words but with a silent measure of character. Aeon stepped forward, her voice carrying as she introduced John to her people. "This John, he helped me, he keep me safe," she said, her words careful but full of meaning. The chief's eyes remained on John, piercing and thoughtful. He finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Why did you help her?" The question was simple, yet it carried weight far beyond the words themselves. It was not a question about who John was or what he had done, but about his heart, his intentions, and his understanding of life and humanity. John felt a deep pause settle over him, considering how to answer honestly. He dismounted slowly, his boots crunching in the snow. "I helped her because she needed help," he said simply. "No one should be left to die in the cold. I could help, so I did." His voice was steady, though he could feel the weight of the chief's gaze upon him. He continued, "I do not know what reward there is in helping another. I only know it is right to do so." The chief listened without interruption, his eyes never leaving John. Aeon translated carefully, making sure the meaning of John's words was clear. The chief nodded slightly, acknowledging the explanation, but his gaze remained thoughtful. He stepped closer, speaking in his own language, and Aeon repeated the words to John. "Your heart is measured not by strength, not by wealth, but by compassion. You have shown that you understand the value of life." John felt a mixture of relief and humility. He had acted without thinking of praise or recognition, yet the chief's approval carried a deep significance he had not anticipated. The chief then invited John to walk with him. They moved slowly through the village, observing the people, the children playing, and the animals carefully tended. He asked John about his life on the ranch, the challenges he had faced, and the winters he had endured. John answered openly, sharing stories of long nights alone, the care of his animals, and the lessons he had learned from the land. The chief listened intently, nodding occasionally, his expression unreadable but respectful. Aeon walked beside John, translating and guiding when necessary. She seemed at ease among her people, yet she never forgot John's presence. She glanced at him often, a small smile of gratitude on her lips. Their bond, forged in the cold wilderness, had grown unbreakable, and now it was clear that her people recognized it as well. After walking through the village, the chief finally stopped near a small fire where several elders had gathered. He gestured for John to sit, and John obeyed, feeling both nervous and honored. The chief spoke again, his words measured and deliberate. "You could have left her to the cold. Many would have. You did not. That tells me much about your spirit." "But tell me, what do you expect in return?" John shook his head. "Nothing," he replied. "I do not expect anything. I only did what I believed was right. Helping another is its own reward." The chief nodded slowly, as if weighing John's words against a long history of actions and consequences. Aeon translated, and the elders murmured quietly among themselves, acknowledging John's honesty and humility. For a long moment, silence filled the space between them. The wind rustled through the nearby trees, carrying the scent of snow and pine. John felt a profound respect for the chief and his people, understanding that this moment was about more than gratitude. It was about recognizing the choices that define a person. The chief finally spoke again, his voice calm but firm. "Your actions speak louder than words. You have shown courage, compassion, and respect. That is enough." John exhaled, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. He had acted from instinct, from a sense of duty and humanity, and now it was acknowledged in a way that went beyond simple thanks. Aeon stepped forward, her voice carrying to the assembled elders. "John, he helped me, he protect me. His heart is true." The chief nodded, a faint smile appearing on his face. The village began to welcome John more openly. Children approached, curious about the man who had saved one of their own. Women offered small gifts of food, blankets, and handmade items. Men nodded respectfully, recognizing the courage and kindness he had shown. John accepted their gestures with humility, aware that he had been granted more than he had expected. He had not only returned Aeon to safety, but he had also earned the trust and respect of an entire community. Aeon and John spent the next hours among the people, sharing stories and laughter. She showed him the small ways of life in the village, the techniques of hunting, fishing, and caring for animals. John shared his own knowledge of ranching and survival, and the exchange of skills became a bridge between two very different worlds. The chief observed quietly, his eyes thoughtful, recognizing the bond that had grown between them. As evening fell, the chief invited John to sit near the central fire, a place of honor among the elders. He spoke of the importance of trust, compassion, and courage in a world often marked by hardship and danger. "Your actions remind us," he said, "that even in the coldest times, the warmth of humanity can guide the lost. You have done more than save a life. You have reminded us of what it means to care for one another." John felt a deep sense of gratitude, realizing that the journey had changed him as much as it had saved Aeon. Aeon sat beside John, resting her hand lightly on his arm. She looked at him with quiet affection and respect, aware that their journey together had created a bond that would last a lifetime. John looked back at her, understanding that he had not only helped her survive, but had also learned the true meaning of trust, compassion, and courage. That night, as the village settled into quiet, John sat outside near the fire with Aeon and a few of the elders. The snow reflected the light of the flames, creating a soft, peaceful glow. The chief spoke one last time, his words calm but filled with wisdom. "The question I asked was simple, but the answer reveals much. You acted from your heart, not for reward, and that is the measure of a man. Remember this and carry it with you always." John nodded, feeling the weight of the chief's words sink in. Aeon leaned against him slightly, a small gesture of trust and friendship. The journey had been long and difficult, but it had forged a connection that neither would forget. The chief's question, "Why did you help her?" had forced John to reflect, to understand the reasons behind his actions, and to recognize the power of compassion. He realized that helping another person, without expectation, could change not only their life but also his own. The night passed peacefully, the cold softened by the warmth of the fire, and the presence of a community that now accepted John as a friend and ally. He knew that the bond with Aeon would continue, and that he had gained more than he could have imagined. The chief's words remained with him, a reminder that acts of kindness, courage, and respect could bridge worlds, heal wounds, and create connections that last a lifetime. By the time the first light of morning touched the village, John understood that this journey had changed him forever. He had ventured into the cold wilderness, faced danger and uncertainty, and found the strength to act with compassion. In doing so, he had not only saved Aeon but had also discovered a deeper understanding of humanity, trust, and the power of the heart. After the long journey and the meeting with the chief, life settled into a quiet rhythm. John returned to his ranch, feeling both relief and a new sense of purpose. The winter had passed, leaving behind snow that slowly melted into the earth, giving life to the hills and fields he had tended for so many years. But something had changed within him. The experience of saving Aeon and seeing her safely return to her people had awakened a sense of connection, an understanding that he had not felt in decades. Back at the ranch, John began his usual routines with a renewed energy. He tended the animals, repaired fences, and cleared paths through the snow. Yet, even in the midst of his work, his thoughts often drifted to Aeon and her village. He remembered the way the chief had questioned him, the wisdom in his eyes, and the quiet approval he had given. That question, "Why did you help her?" continued to echo in John's mind. It was a reminder of the choices that define a person, of the courage it takes to act from compassion rather than expectation. Aeon visited the ranch often. Her people respected her connection with John and encouraged the friendship that had formed. Each visit brought stories, laughter, and a sense of warmth that filled the ranch like sunlight breaking through winter clouds. She shared tales of life in the village, of games with children, lessons in hunting, and the simple joys of community. John listened with fascination, learning more about her culture, her people, and the wisdom embedded in the traditions she cherished. Over time, John realized that Aeon's presence had changed not only his days but also his perspective on life. He began to see the land differently, noticing the patterns in the seasons, the signs of animals, and the quiet beauty in small moments. He started keeping track of the cycles of nature, following advice Aeon had shared about reading the earth. Together, they planted a small garden near the cabin, mixing seeds from the village with his own knowledge of the land. It became a symbol of their connection, of learning from each other, and of nurturing life in all its forms. The friendship between John and Aeon grew deeper. They shared quiet evenings by the fire, talking about hopes, fears, and the lessons they had learned. Aeon admired John's strength and dedication, not just to the land but to the principles that guided his life. John admired Aeon's wisdom, courage, and the way she had faced the wilderness with determination and grace. Their bond was built on mutual respect, forged in the trials of survival, and strengthened by the understanding that they could rely on each other no matter what challenges arose. One spring morning, as the first flowers began to bloom, John reflected on how much he had learned from Aeon. He remembered the days in the snow, the narrow escapes, and the moments of fear and hope. He realized that the journey had been about more than saving a life. It had been about understanding the value of trust, compassion, and human connection. He had learned that true courage is not only in facing physical danger, but also in choosing to act with kindness when it is needed most. Aeon noticed John's quiet reflection and smiled. "You change," she said softly. "Ranch different now," John chuckled. "I think I see things a little differently, yes. I've learned more about patience, care, and seeing the world through another's eyes." She nodded, her expression thoughtful. "We teach each other stronger now," John agreed. "Yes, together we are stronger. And I've learned that some lessons can only come from experiences we share with others." The seasons passed, and the bond between John and Aeon became a source of inspiration for those around them. Neighbors and travelers often heard stories of the rancher who had rescued a young woman from the deadly cold and the wisdom he had gained from her. The story spread, not as a tale of heroism or adventure, but as a lesson in trust, courage, and compassion. People began to understand that sometimes a single act of kindness can create ripples that touch many lives. John also noticed changes in himself that went beyond his work on the ranch. He became more patient with the animals, more attentive to the land, and more open to learning from those around him. Aeon's influence had reminded him that knowledge is not one-sided, and that wisdom often comes from listening, observing, and respecting the experiences of others. He began documenting small lessons about the land, the seasons, and the animals, combining his knowledge with Aeon's insights. This notebook would later serve as a guide for others who wished to understand the delicate balance between humans and nature. Aeon, too, carried lessons from their journey back to her village. She shared stories of the ranch, of the courage John had shown, and the ways he had cared for her. Her people listened attentively, appreciating the bridge that had formed between their community and the world beyond the mountains. They celebrated the partnership of trust and friendship that had been created, understanding that such connections could bring strength, knowledge, and hope to both communities. On warm summer evenings, John and Aeon would sit by the river near the ranch, watching the water flow and listening to the sounds of birds and animals. They talked about the journey, about the moments of fear and triumph, and about the lessons learned along the way. Aeon would often laugh softly at John's stubbornness, and John would shake his head, smiling at her quiet determination. These simple moments, filled with companionship and understanding, became the true reward of their shared experiences. As the years passed, their friendship remained strong. They continued to visit each other, exchange stories, and learn from one another. John's ranch became not just a place of work, but a home enriched by connection, learning, and the warmth of friendship. Aeon's village thrived, strengthened by the lessons of courage, trust, and the understanding that even strangers can become allies when hearts are guided by compassion. John often reflected on the chief's question, "Why did you help her?" and realized its significance grew with time. It was more than a simple inquiry. It was a mirror for his own choices and values. Every time he faced a challenge, he remembered the lesson of that winter, that true action comes from the heart without expectation, and that compassion can change lives in ways beyond measure. Aeon, too, often spoke of John's influence. She had learned the importance of patience, observation, and relying on the kindness of others. She had also gained confidence in herself, knowing that she could survive the harshest conditions and navigate difficult choices with courage and wisdom. Together, their experiences created a shared legacy of strength, trust, and understanding. The winter that had brought them together seemed long ago, yet its lessons were ever present. John's heart had grown warmer, not just from friendship, but from the realization that human connection is a force as vital as survival itself. Aeon had found a renewed sense of hope and confidence, strengthened by the knowledge that someone had acted selflessly to ensure her safety. Their journey had begun with fear and uncertainty, but it had ended in trust, respect, and a profound understanding of the power of compassion. Even the animals and the land seemed to reflect the change. The ranch flourished under John's careful attention and Aeon's advice. The cattle were healthier, the fields greener, and the rhythms of life more harmonious. It was as if the lessons learned in the cold wilderness had extended beyond the people to the very land itself, creating a balance that brought peace and prosperity. One autumn evening, as the leaves turned gold and the air carried the crisp scent of approaching winter, John and Aeon sat together on the porch of the cabin. They watched the sun dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the ranch. Aeon leaned back, smiling softly. "We journey far," she said. "Learn much." John nodded, his eyes on the horizon. "Yes, we did. And it's not just about surviving. It's about understanding, caring, and living with respect for each other." Aeon reached over, placing her hand lightly on John's arm. "Friend forever," she said. John smiled, feeling the truth of her words. The bond they had formed would not fade with time or distance. It had been forged in adversity, tested by the elements, and strengthened by the trust and compassion they had shared. Their story, though quiet in its telling, became a lasting lesson for both communities. Neighbors spoke of John's courage and Aeon's resilience. Children listened wide-eyed to the tale of survival and trust. Elders nodded in approval at the wisdom gained through their journey. And John and Aeon continued to live, learn, and grow, carrying with them the knowledge that even in the harshest conditions, kindness, courage, and respect can create connections that last a lifetime. John often thought about that first night in the cabin, when Aeon had been cold, frightened, and alone. He had acted without hesitation, driven by instinct and compassion. Now, years later, he understood that it was more than instinct. It was the choice to act with heart, to see the humanity in another person, and to commit to something greater than oneself. Aeon had reminded him that even in a solitary life, connection and trust were not only possible but necessary. As the sun rose and set over the ranch, the seasons changed, and life continued in its quiet rhythm. But for John and Aeon, the lessons of the winter remained. They had faced danger, hardship, and uncertainty, and emerged with not just survival, but wisdom, respect, and a bond that would last forever. They had learned that the true measure of a person is not in their strength alone, but in the courage of their heart and the willingness to act with compassion when it matters most. And so, the ranch, the village, and the people around them continued their lives, enriched by the story of a man who rescued a young woman from the deadly cold, and a woman whose courage and trust changed everything. The winter that had once threatened to take life had instead given them a gift far greater, a lifelong friendship, a bridge between worlds, and a reminder that even in the harshest times, the warmth of the human heart can guide the way.